What was in the mind of Winston Churchill? Why did he think that he could afford not to negotiate? In terms of supreme command, the Allies were very lucky because had the war broken out when Stanley Baldwin was Prime Minister, I think Britain would have not done very well at all. It broke out when Neville Chamberlain was Prime Minister, but quickly he began to bring people in the cabinet who advised him, corrected him, educated him about what was going on. He still felt that there was some chance of a negotiated peace after the fall of France, but on May 10th, 1940, the day that Germany invaded France, there was a radical change of government. Winston Churchill came in, and Churchill was determined to not surrender, not negotiate, but not only fight the Germans and the Italians, but defeat them. Now, this was a very strange idea because within 3 weeks there would just be Britain and there would be all of occupied Europe. So what was in the mind of Winston Churchill? Why did he think that he could afford not to negotiate? Hitler had offered him a deal where he said, "We will not invade or bomb you, and we will let you have your empire. Just call off the war." And then Hitler thought that he would turn his attention then without a worry over either Britain or the United States, and he could turn his attention to the Soviet Union. But Churchill was not just a romantic. He was a very brilliant guy who was convinced that the last-minute armament of the Royal Air Force, given the fact that the Royal Navy was the largest navy in the world, meant if everybody took a deep breath, they said to themselves, for all of Germany's continental ground power, land forces, they cannot get across the channel because the British Navy will sink ships from the German Navy, and they do not have the ability to achieve air superiority over Britain, and therefore they can't attack us. And Churchill said, well, you know what, we can't invade either, so there's going to be a standoff, and that standoff is going to favor us, because eventually authoritarians like Hitler and Stalin cannot trust each other. They'll have a falling out, and at some point they will fight each other, and that will be to our advantage. And at some point we understand that either the Japanese or the Germans or the Italians will do something stupid and draw the United States into the war. Churchill was already envisioning an alliance that was to happen a year and a half later of the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire against the Axis triad, and they would have enormous advantages in terms of manpower, population, industrial strength, and geography. And that's exactly what happened. In America, it's hard to think how we would have been prepared for Pearl Harbor without Franklin Roosevelt. By that I mean the Republican Party was primarily isolationist, and the Democratic Party was focused on the Great Depression. And so at this time, people were saying we cannot invest in military expenses and armies and navies and air forces. FDR, along with a brilliant Congressman, Carl Vinson, thought otherwise. And FDR understood that wherever we were going to fight, Pacific or European theaters, we needed a navy to transport soldiers over there and to protect them from coming over here. So in a series of naval acts in the late 1930s, the Carl Vinson Naval Act 1, 2, 3, and etc., we had on the books a new Pacific fleet about 5 times larger than was at Pearl Harbor and much better, characterized by Baltimore heavy cruisers, Essex carriers, the Iowa-class battleships. That was already on the books. It was already budgeted before we went into World War II. And FDR, in sometimes cagey Machiavellian fashion, was reassuring an isolationist nation in 1940 that it would not go to war, even though he was taking quite dramatic steps to prepare it to go to war and might even welcome it going to war. If the Second World War was ultimately a story of people, how people died, and how people made decisions that determined which side won or lost, I think we can sum it up by the results, because the proof of the pudding is always in the eating. And when we look at this vast canvas of death that was the Second World War, 65 million people, and we have to ask ourselves, why were they able to be so successful in the war? And I think the answer is the United States and the British had an overarching principle that they were going to find ways to win the war and to wage it with the least possible injury to their own country's populations. And that was completely diametrically opposed to the Axis powers' war of aggression, where they thought that we're super people, we're going to destroy inferiors, and if we lose people, it's a glorious thing to die during a war. Or in the Soviet Union's idea that all that matters is survival of the Soviet state. Millions do not matter if the Soviet principle, the Soviet project survives. Ultimately, then, the story of people turns out to be the brilliance of Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt in leading the democracies not just to war, but to a victorious war, and at very little cost in comparison to the other belligerents.
Thank you for watching. We hope you're enjoying our highlight series and invite you to explore our complete course on the Second World Wars. All of Hillsdale College's online courses are free and for everyone who loves to learn.